So we're hoping to do some regular interviews with the SDIA during 2023. But as this is the first one, I thought the obvious place to start is to understand a little bit about the Sustainable Digital Infrastructure Alliance, to give it its full name, SDIA for short. So a little bit about, when it was formed, why it was formed, just the basics, how it came about.
Yeah, good question. Actually, founded 4 years ago now. This is the fourth year. Originally in Hamburg, in Germany, and yeah, as an now it's an association. So that's the construct. It's a non-profit organization in Germany, but formed as an association with members, with the special feature that our members are there and they support us, but they don't have direct voting rights, which is very important for us to remain independent in our position taking and views and things like this.
Okay, and in terms of the actual structure of the organization, you mentioned obviously the members. So I'm curious, is it only companies that can join? Can individuals join? And in terms of the steering groups and other initiatives, because I think you're essentially going to be doing a conference. You yeah, what activities do you get up to, and who can participate?
Yeah, so we are open for everyone, and membership by design for individuals is free as well. So there's no barrier to entry. For us, it was always very important to be an open place where really everybody can come together who cares about creating a sustainable digital economy and sustainable digital society and infrastructure. It should be one place where yeah, the whole value chain can come together. So you don't just have data center people, but you also have IT people who are the clients, so to say, and then you have people who work on open source, you have people who work on electrical systems, who work in the energy sector, because ultimately the digital world is it starts with an electron and ends somewhere with software. So all these people should be there if you really want to make it sustainable.
Okay, and in terms of the roadmap, which I guess covers a little bit of as again, the structure in terms of committee steering groups and all that, what sort of topics, bearing in mind what you just said, from sort of electrons up to sort of the applications, the end result or whatever, um, what what are your major areas of focus at the moment, or have been
Yeah,
for a while?
the roadmap. So part of our core belief and thesis is that in principle, the digital economy, so all these, everything that we call software technology or tech or whatever, all these companies that exist only purely in the digital space and make money there, that in principle, that sector can be the growth engine of our future without making a lot of environmental impact, ideally no environmental impact, being good for society, being good for the economy. We think there's a lot of potential good that can come from the digital world. But we also need to address, of course, its potential downsides, right? So we need to really shape how we want it to look like. And we started originally with looking at infrastructure because we said, look, the only physical footprint of the digital world is its physical infrastructure, which is data centers, fiber, energy, all these things. So we need to first of all start with a plan on how to get that infrastructure to be environmentally sustainable. Right? And the roadmap is that plan, how to get the infrastructure to be environmentally sustainable. This includes the building materials, it includes the cooling systems, it includes heat recovery, integrating renewable energy, moving the infrastructure closer to wind turbines, everything you could possibly imagine that would have a positive impact on reducing energy use, reducing CO2, reducing ADP, which is resource depletion, reducing water. It's all in there. But once we did actually release the roadmap 2 or 3 years ago, the focus went very clearly to the first items on the roadmap, which is how do you actually measure the environmental impact of the infrastructure? Because we realized once we started gathering data and looking at where are we at right now, that the data that is currently available is insufficient to actually determine what the state of affairs are in the digital infrastructure space. So right now, one of our key focus areas is really how to measure the environmental impact.
Okay, and in terms of that, are you using the sort of scopes 1 to 3 model? Is that sort of what you're basing it on, or are you doing something else?
So there's a very important distinction that I think a lot of people sometimes forget is There's this word that I deliberately use, environmental impact. And then there's this whole GHG protocol. There is the carbon reporting initiative. This is really, those things are all about carbon emissions. And environmental impact is really about how much copper am I taking out of the earth? How much dirty water am I putting back? How much also carbon do I emit, but also other gases? Yeah, there's not just carbon, and so we look at it a little bit more holistically. Of course, carbon is in there, and we don't just look at, so to say, scope one, two, or three. We look at the sector as a whole. We say, look, the sector might be the most favorite topic, right, of us is always energy. So the sector might be, based on the IEA, use this many gigawatt hours of energy. Then the question is not how do we become more efficient. For us, the question is how do we reduce the energy use in total, right? And we could say, oh, it's consuming 40,000 gigatons of copper, which I honestly don't have any reliable number on that. And then the question is, okay, how do we get rid of either the sector using copper at all or reducing it, or, for example, thinking about how does it become circular, right? So environmental impact is really the whole discipline of all the impacts and not just carbon, because you can do a lot of things to optimize your carbon emissions while creating other damaging impacts that it's just, we had this with water and energy. I can use more water in a cooling system, then I use less energy, but then using so much water can have another downside. So you always have to look at the whole thing in order to see, so what positive impact do you have, and what's the environmental cost of that.
Yeah, and so are you trying to create a sort of best practice model then to guide people to understand this holistic approach? Is that what you're hoping to publish at some stage, or are you just sort of doing the work and then disseminating it sort of on a more more sort of low key basis, if you like, rather than a sort of headline? This is what everyone needs to do.
So this is something that we actually learned a lot about. So when we started the SDA, the thesis was, we have this roadmap, clearly outlining what are the challenges that need to be addressed. And then we have vendors and friends and individuals who say, hey, I can solve this problem, or I have a solution to solve this problem. And we simply have to communicate those solutions. And then, morals and peer pressure will lead people to just change and use the more sustainable solution rather than the unsustainable solution. That's very idealistic, because that discounts that people want to make a profit, and most of the time a sustainable solution may be the more expensive one at this point. So what we learned is that that alone is not enough. So what we pivoted in the last year, I think also very visibly, is more towards the policy side, to also say, look, there needs to be regulation in place to force certain things, because it doesn't matter how easy the solution is or how attractive the solution is, most of these infrastructure companies will not change if there's nobody forcing them, either the customer or the regulator. So we have been working a lot with both regulators and customers to increase the pressure on the infrastructure, not in a bad way, but again, I also wouldn't change all of my infrastructure for a lot of money if nobody is asking me to do it, right? So creating that pressure is now become more of a center focus for us.
Okay, and I know you do a lot of sort of work in terms of highlighting sustainability projects. I mean, do you actively get involved in those yourself, or do you act as a sort of center point that you can then disseminate and put people in touch with each other to work on these? How does that work?
We try to be, so to say, the hub, the center point. We also participate in some research projects ourselves, but more in the sense to figure out, can we extract new knowledge, new insights, and make them available publicly to our community, to the sector. I think a good example are a lot of things we put out on the topic of heat recovery. That's again something we started with. We also put out this very strong report on the potential synergies between the energy sector and the digital infrastructure sector. That's always been well received. And so we try to put out a lot of knowledge and information and insight, again, informing policy discussions, helping people, develop new sustainable solutions to solve problems, but also for the operators or the infrastructure owners themselves to see, okay, there's this is where we need to focus right now. And so we I think we've done a pretty good job at becoming this hub, at least in Europe, of insight and knowledge.
And in terms, just quickly on that, I mean, in terms of the engagement, you say obviously individuals, companies can join. Are you happy with the makeup of the member? Have you got data centers themselves engaging with you as well as the supply chain, or are they, you know, not come to the table? Just some sort of, I guess, a cross section, a slice of your membership, just to
Yeah,
understand
I
it.
think I think it's easy to say that we probably have all the innovators in each part of the value creation chain. So if you're thinking about data centers that do interesting stuff, you often think about things like people like block heating with their greenhouses. You think about maybe the wind cloud people doing the algae farm to use the heat. You think about eco data center in Sweden and Balk in Norway, the Nordic people. So all of these are there. And then also all the manufacturers of more sustainable infrastructure components like Legrand and Vertiv are all there. So we have all the people that are really pushing forward. We have there, and we do not have a lot of the, let's say, more traditional operators there, because it's always been, yeah, we've struggled sometimes to convince them that supporting this is a good idea, especially because we are a bit more pro regulation, of course, like I just said, than others. I think the status quo serves a lot of people very well. I think though everybody also agrees that without pressure there won't be change.
Yeah, okay. And in terms of what you've, as an organisation, say you've been going back about 4 years, what would be the highlights in terms of what you think you've achieved, or what you obviously you've undertaken a lot of activities, but some highlights as to what you think, we've done that well, or we've helped raise this profile. And also, sorry, the part two is what's on the plan for this year as well, if you can share a few insights.
I think that's actually a very good question. I think one of the highlights for us, so we learned a lot. I think we learned how to change, to how to drive change in this sector. I think we also saw that the problem is a lot bigger than just focusing on infrastructure. It has a lot to do with what you build on top of it, and also, so to say, the business models that are going on in the digital economy itself. We also learned a lot about how little people understand about how actually the digital world is powered. How does it actually, how does the infrastructure look like that works on it? So that's a lot of things that we learned, and I'm always really proud of learning things and experiencing things. But on the more concrete side, I think we've been really successful at raising the profile of the topic of heat recovery. And I think in Germany, we see now there's a law in discussion where there will be forced heat recovery, which again, you can or cannot agree with it, but it's definitely a sign that there's a lot of progress. On the European level, I think it's now everybody agrees that there is a lack of data about the digital infrastructure sector, which I think is also mostly to our, that can be accredited to us, really saying, look, how do we know if it's sustainable or not if we don't have any information and data? And I think another thing that we've accomplished is in the Netherlands to really raise the profile of the Netherlands, who wants to really be a thought leader and drive the collaboration between France, the Netherlands, and Germany on that European level, which has been, I think, very fruitful in coming up with progressive policy towards digital infrastructure companies in all three countries. So I think, in a nutshell, those are really highlights. There's an enormous amount. I think we have now more than 1,000 individual members. We hosted a lot of events. It's We have this amazing community that's also, you see it always on social media, how many people are talking about the topics that we are talking about now, that are all coming from our community, and it makes me incredibly proud that we've been able to create that movement.
And in terms of the roadmap for this year, is it more of the same, or have you got any particular highlights, projects you're working on, or events that you're working towards?
Yeah, I think so. So we are still really pushing the transparency topic. I think that you will see a lot of announcements around us releasing tooling more for the software part to really measure their environmental impact and also drive more requirements towards the infrastructure people. Another thing that we will come out with, or we started already come out with, is a sustainability certificate for cloud infrastructure companies. I think we've set criteria for data centers, we set criteria for software to be sustainable, but we haven't really set the criteria for the thing in the middle, the hosting, cloud infrastructure, infrastructure as a service space. And I think that's been well received. And yeah, I think there will be, I can already tease you, there will be a very big announcement coming out in the next coming weeks on, so to say, the path we're going to go on going forward. But in terms of content, it will be very focused right now on transparency, and yeah, measuring and getting the data in place to really assess the state of sustainability in the digital sector.
Okay, and then I say we're hopefully going to have regular conversation input, but I'll ask a few sort of topical. We talked a bit about the SCA, but just your own thoughts now. In terms of the scale of the challenge, I mean, I think it's fair to say that sustainability has risen up the agenda in the last couple of years, whereas once maybe data center industry paid a bit of lip service, maybe planted a few trees and offset their carbon emissions, said, we're green, whatever. And now we seem to be getting to the next stage where they are beginning to, but I'd just like to understand what you think the scale of the challenge is, and how optimistic you are that whether it's, I think is the climate neutral data center pact, I think it's got 2030 on there, and then more widely, I think 2050 is the date where the COP summit suggests is where we're all going to end up, at net zero. So just your thoughts as to, that the likelihood of us making, significant progress, I suppose.
I always I always have a lot of faith in the digital infrastructure sector, because I always meet a lot of people who are A, very smart, and B, very committed to sustainability. So I have very high hopes and high expectations, you could say it like this. I think what is difficult though is that the next step is a paradigm shift. And what I mean by that is you can compare it to the gasoline engine in a car, right? For a long time, we've just been making that more efficient, right? 30%, 35%, 40%. And that was the engineering challenge. How do we make that engine more efficient? And then all of a sudden came the electric car, and it blew everybody away. Like, oh, it's also a car, but it's not what we've been working on. And I think the sector really needs to get ready to shift away from discussing engineering problems, which is, for example, PUE and efficiency, and how do we make it more efficient, to really think about what is the digital infrastructure going to look like in the future, and what are the business models that will power that. Because I don't think we will continue building co-location facilities for the next 100 years. Co-location was already a paradigm shift from what was there before. Cloud was another paradigm shift, right, from a business model perspective. And now I think the next generation, it's not edge, it's not distributed, it's just, I think we need to get ready for that that big business model / how do we build the infrastructure shift, and think about that shift rather than thinking about how do we tweak what we have. Right? And I think has not yet arrived in the heads of a lot of people, that it's not how do we make these buildings now more sustainable. It's about how do we create more sustainable infrastructure going forward as well.
And do you think there's a genuine commitment? I mean, governments, whether it's my own UK government, the EU, other nations' government, do you think they're all sending out the right signals, or is there danger of some mixed messages, particularly when we see the energy crisis and suddenly everybody's not going to mothball their coal-fired power stations because we need it for a bit longer? So, I know it's a very complex problem, but do you think fundamentally the commitment is there from governments and industries, individual companies, or is there still a way to go to persuade some of the more skeptical people that we do actually need to do this, otherwise the sea levels are going to rise and everything else that follows is not going to look very nice in whether it's 20, 50, 100 years?
I think so. There's two components to this that I think that are worth mentioning. To answer your question, I think that policymakers are interested, and governments are very interested, because this narrative of digitalization and the power of the digital economy, and you have these massive global companies rising, and it triggers two questions. First of all, how do I get those into my country? But then you also get eventually to the question, what's the rail that these big trains are driving on? What's the infrastructure that powers this? And for a long time, the infrastructure was called, skill. You need people, educated labor. That you have IT people. That's the only infrastructure you need. And I think people come to grips with the realization that you need fiber, you need data centers, you need servers, you need all this really physical, complex infrastructure. And that's a globally distributed value creation chain that actually makes that infrastructure happen. And that's what a lot of policy people are now coming to understand, that it's not just bits and bytes and data. There's actual physical infrastructure that's necessary. And the second piece that I find more as a risk, and I've made this clear also to a lot of the other associations that are around, that the narrative that is currently being spun about, digitalization is all about upside. I think I generally agree that there is a massive potential upside, but failing to educate regulators and policymakers on the potential downsides and how you're going to manage those, and just trying to avoid talking about it, that there is a downside, is going to create this risk of really bad regulation, because they're just going to be like, yeah, but we're just going to do something now, and we don't really understand it, but we're going to regulate it because we want to. And it would be much more useful, I think, right now to help educate and really teach people what's a data center, why do we need it, how does it work, what's the negative impact, and not just make it sound like it's a cloud and the cloud is made out of is in the sky, and when it rains, data centers are sad, and when it's sunny, data centers are happy. Um, that create real information, real education, and really enable regulators to create good regulation. I think going against it, there's no point in it. Every government wants to protect its infrastructure.
I think you sort of hinted at what I'm going to ask in your earlier on in the conversation, but in terms of what's needed, we seem to be evolving still, gentle steps. Is it time for a radical sort of revolution in terms? I'm thinking, for example, I clearly understand why data centers are often built in certain places. One fully gets that, but do we need to start thinking whether we build them all in the Nordics, or climates where cooling is free and operations a lot more potentially energy efficient? Is that the sort of radical things, and all legacy data centers will need to just be closed down, because however much you try and upgrade them, they're never going to be that energy efficient, sustainable? What do you see? Can we keep sort of tinkering and getting there, or as I say, do people really need to go back to basics and say, what is a data center, how do we build it, where do we build it, etc.?
Yeah, I think I always say the most sustainable data center is the one we don't have to build. So I think it's about, if I could, right, I would set a constraint and say we can't build any more data centers, and then let the IT sector and people figure out how we can squeeze out a lot more from what we currently have. I think that's, you wouldn't build a power plant, right, in the UK if you don't really need more power. So you can control, you can just keep on building more power plants, or you can say, well, can we reduce how much power we need? And I think that's the paradigm shift that I would like to see on the infrastructure side. I think the more mental challenge is to accept that data center business used to be a very specialized, outsourced activity of enterprise. And what it has become is infrastructure. And this infrastructure generates resources, doesn't really matter what they are, and it benefits from more consumption of those resources. So if the digital economy grows, the infrastructure grows with it, right? And that business model will be challenged, I think, going forward, as it was in the energy sector, because if that were the case, we would go back to the times when General Electric in the US also sold fridges, right? Because you would then incentivize people to consume more and more energy because you're selling energy. And I think we will, in the energy sector, that has triggered a lot of regulation to make sure that nobody's selling fridges and incentivizing using energy and wasting it. I think we will get the same kind of regulation in the digital infrastructure sector, because right now there's no disincentive to avoid waste, to maximize utilization rates and occupation rates. Everybody always says there's a business incentive, but there's also, yeah, I don't think that really is enough. I think a half empty data center is already profitable. And there is, yeah, we, I won't go into the details, but the paradigm shift is accept that your infrastructure, and think about what are the business models going forward, that are sustainable.
Okay, well, I think for now we'll leave it there. But I say I'm looking forward to chatting to you and other folks in the SDA over the coming months. But Max, thanks very much for your time. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Phil.